He pushed the mop bucket across the glossy marble floor, his worn-out sneakers squeaking softly with each step. His yellow t-shirt, faded by countless washes, clung to his thin frame. As he polished the last corner of the grand mathematics hall, the heavy oak doors swung open with a bang. A group of sharply dressed students spilled into the room, laughing loudly. Behind them, Professor Charles Whitmore, a man whose reputation for brilliance was only rivaled by his arrogance, entered, adjusting his tailored black blazer. Whitmore's gaze landed sharply on the simple man cleaning the floor. He smirked, as if the mere sight of him was an offense to the prestigious halls of the university. "Careful," Whitmore called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "We wouldn't want you to smear the brilliance of academia with that filthy mop, would we?" Laughter erupted from the students, echoing off the polished walls. Ethan froze, his face flushing a deep crimson. He lowered his head, pushing the mop forward silently, determined not to let the humiliation sink too deep. But fate had a cruel twist planned. As Ethan moved away, his eyes lingered for a brief second on the massive chalkboard where an unsolved equation had been left overnight, a monstrous problem that had stumped even the finest minds of the university. Whitmore caught his glance. "What are you looking at, janitor?" he sneered. "Planning to solve it? Perhaps in between mopping up spilled coffee?" The students howled with laughter again, some pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Ethan said nothing. He simply wiped his hands on his jeans, picked up his bucket, and left the room with his dignity trailing behind him like a torn banner. What none of them knew, what none of them could know, was that beneath that yellow shirt and tired frame lived a mind sharper than any Whitmore had ever encountered. And tomorrow night, under the same vaulted ceilings, a revelation would shake the foundations of their world. But tonight he would carry the weight of their judgment home, feeling every whispered insult cling to his skin like an invisible armor he never wanted to wear. The world had seen a simple cleaner. It was about to meet a silent genius. By the time Ethan Blake was 8 years old, he could calculate complex fractions faster than most adults could blink. But while other prodigies were nurtured and celebrated, Ethan grew up in the shadows of broken promises and forgotten dreams. His parents, hard-working factory workers, could barely afford food, let alone tutors or private schools, so Ethan found his teachers in second-hand books rescued from dusty thrift stores. He built his world from tattered pages and late-night whispers to the stars. By day, he worked. By night, he learned. It wasn't ambition that drove him. It was something quieter, something more resilient, a belief that knowledge, like kindness, was its own reward. Years later, when adulthood came crashing in, Ethan didn't chase degrees or titles. He took jobs that kept the lights on. Mechanic, grocery stocker, janitor. Always invisible, always underestimated. But every spare second he found was devoted to numbers, to logic, to the beauty of patterns no one else seemed to notice. Hidden from the world's cruel judgments, he filled notebooks with theories and solutions, some so advanced they would have baffled even seasoned scholars. Yet not once did he seek recognition. Fame had never been the dream. Impact was. Before anyone at the university had even heard his name, Ethan Blake had already touched lives in ways most would never understand. 2 years earlier, he had anonymously funded a community program that taught underprivileged kids how to code and solve basic mathematical problems. It wasn't much, a modest classroom tucked behind a rundown library. But to the kids who walked in lost and left empowered, it was everything. He remembered one boy in particular, Marcus, 10 years old, struggling with anger and loneliness. After 3 months in the program, Marcus won his district's math competition and found a path that would lead him to a scholarship. Ethan had watched from the shadows, never stepping forward, never claiming credit. It was enough to know he had helped shape a better future. As he mopped the marble floors of the university, few would suspect that the man in the yellow t-shirt had quietly built bridges of hope, while others flaunted their empty titles. He was a simple man, but there was nothing simple about the heart beating inside his chest, and though the world tried to crush it, some fires refused to go out. Not even humiliation could dim the light Ethan carried, though tonight, as he trudged home under the heavy sky, doubt gnawed at the edges of his soul. That night, Ethan sat alone at the small wooden table in his modest apartment, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. His calloused hands turned the pages of a battered notebook, ink smudged from countless hours of work. He paused, his gaze falling on a page filled with intricate formulas, his personal masterpiece, equations that could have filled lecture halls with gasps and applause, equations that, tonight, felt like meaningless scribbles. He closed the notebook and rubbed his tired eyes. Maybe it doesn't matter, he whispered to the empty room. Maybe it really didn't. Maybe brilliance, when trapped inside a body the world refused to see, was just another kind of prison. Claire's voice echoed gently in his mind, a memory from brighter days. The world doesn't define you, Ethan. Your heart does. He smiled weakly at the thought of his wife. Claire believed in him when even he struggled to. She had always seen beyond the dust and the broken dreams. Tomorrow she would ask how his day had gone, and he would lie, just like he always did, saying, "It was fine." He couldn't tell her about the humiliation, about the way Professor Whitmore's laughter had crawled under his skin, burrowed deep into places he thought were armored by years of resilience. He couldn't tell her because she would hurt for him, and he couldn't bear to be the source of her pain. Instead, he stood, slowly moving toward the cracked window. He looked out at the sprawling city, its lights blinking like distant stars, and he made himself a quiet promise. He would not become bitter. He would not let their ignorance define his worth. But still, a small, dangerous question wormed its way into his mind. Is it really worth it, being good in a world that doesn't care? The question sat with him, heavy and cruel, as the night stretched endlessly ahead. In the shadows of injustice, even the purest hearts sometimes falter. But somewhere deep inside, Ethan's flame still flickered, stubborn, defiant. Tomorrow wasn't promised, but if it came, maybe, just maybe, it would bring something more than empty echoes. Maybe it would bring a chance to be seen, or maybe it would bring another day of silence. Either way, he would show up, because simple men like Ethan Blake didn't just survive, they endured. The next evening, long after the professors had left and the students had vanished into the night, Ethan returned to the mathematics hall. He didn't have to. His shift had ended hours ago, but something pulled him back, a stubborn part of him refusing to let the day's humiliation define him. He stepped into the grand room, mop and bucket forgotten at the door. The chalkboard loomed ahead, still bearing the monstrous equation that had taunted him the night before. His heart thudded heavily as he picked up a piece of white chalk, fingers trembling slightly. For a moment he hesitated. Then, in one deliberate stroke after another, he began to write. Complex derivatives, matrix transformations, abstract proofs. His mind flowed like a river unchained, each line an elegant dance across the black canvas. His body moved with the grace of someone who had fought 1,000 unseen battles and knew this was where he truly belonged. He didn't hear the soft creak of the door behind him. He didn't see the figure step into the room, watching in stunned silence. Dr. Samuel Hawthorne, the oldest and most respected professor at the university, had returned to retrieve a forgotten briefcase. Instead, he found himself frozen at the threshold, eyes wide in disbelief. He recognized the equation. He knew the struggle it had caused, a riddle that had left scholars scratching their heads for months. And here, before his very eyes, the janitor, the man everyone ignored, was solving it with an ease that bordered on the divine. Hawthorne didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe too loudly, afraid to disrupt the miracle unfolding. Minutes passed, then an hour. When Ethan finally stepped back, surveying his work, he wore no pride on his face, only quiet satisfaction, the look of a man who had proven something to himself, even if no one else would ever know. Or so he thought. A soft clapping echoed through the cavernous hall. Startled, Ethan spun around, dropping the chalk. There stood Dr. Hawthorne, his eyes shimmering with something Ethan couldn't quite place. Awe, perhaps. Or something even rarer in these hallowed halls. Respect. That, Hawthorne said, voice rough with emotion, was the most brilliant thing I've ever witnessed. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed again, words failing him. For the first time in a long time, someone had truly seen him, and the world, the one that had dismissed him, mocked him, shoved him into the margins, began to tilt ever so slightly, readying itself for a shift that would change everything. For a long moment, the two men simply stood there, the weight of the moment anchoring them in silence. Then Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward, extending his hand, not as a professor to a janitor, but as one mind to another. "I'm Samuel Hawthorne," he said warmly, "and you, young man, are a revelation." Ethan hesitated before shaking his hand, his calloused fingers meeting the professor's firm grip. "Ethan Blake," he replied, voice barely more than a whisper. The next morning, while the university still slept under the veil of pre-dawn mist, Hawthorne made calls to colleagues, to board members, to old friends who owed him favors. His voice carried an urgency they hadn't heard in years. By noon, whispers had started weaving through the corridors like wildfire. Whispers about the janitor, about the impossible solution, about the respected Dr. Hawthorne vouching for a man no one had ever truly seen. Students who had once laughed now exchanged uncertain glances. Professors who had once turned their backs now craned their necks for a glimpse of the man they had ridiculed. But Ethan didn't revel in the attention. While others would have seized the spotlight, he retreated, working quietly, answering questions, with a soft humility that only deepened the awe growing around him. When invited to meet with the university's board, Ethan arrived wearing the same yellow t-shirt and jeans he had worn when mopping floors. No pretense, no facade. And when they asked him to explain his thought process behind solving the unsolvable, he spoke with a clarity and passion that left the room in stunned silence. He didn't speak for accolades. He spoke because, for the first time, someone had asked. Days later, an article appeared in a prestigious academic journal, anonymously authored but clearly inspired by Ethan's breakthrough. Funding offers for research flooded in. Institutions and think tanks wanted to know more about this hidden genius. Still, Ethan refused to let the frenzy change him. He continued to clean, even after being offered a formal scholarship and a role as a visiting researcher, because for Ethan Blake, success wasn't about abandoning who he was. It was about proving that you could rise, not by erasing your roots, but by honoring them. The same halls that had once echoed with mockery now buzzed with respect. And somewhere in the shadows of that great university, a simple man taught them all a lesson no textbook ever could. But Ethan's journey was just beginning. The grand auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Students, professors, and board members filled every seat, curious to witness the unveiling of a discovery that had already begun to stir ripples beyond the university walls. Ethan Blake, the janitor once mocked and overlooked, was about to present his findings. But it wasn't just the curious who gathered. Professor Charles Whitmore sat rigidly in the front row, arms crossed, face a cold mask. The same man who had once humiliated Ethan now found himself a reluctant witness to a reality he had refused to see. When Ethan walked onto the stage, dressed once again in his faded yellow t-shirt and jeans, a hush fell over the crowd. No grand suit, no polished image, just a man, simple, steady, undeniable. The massive screen behind him lit up with complex equations and revolutionary insights. Yet when Ethan spoke, it wasn't the complexity of his work that captivated the audience. It was his heart. He explained his theories with such passion and clarity that even the most skeptical minds found themselves leaning forward, drawn into a world where beauty was hidden in numbers and greatness wore no disguise. Halfway through his presentation, Ethan paused, scanning the audience. His eyes briefly met Whitmore's. For a split second, time seemed to freeze, and in that, silence. Whitmore realized the full extent of his own arrogance, not because Ethan gloated, but because he didn't. Ethan offered no smug smile, no pointed words, only a quiet nod, as if saying, "I forgive you, even if you never ask for forgiveness." The weight of that silent grace hit harder than any revenge ever could. When the final slide faded and the lights came back on, the room erupted in a standing ovation. Students cheered, professors clapped, some wiping tears from their eyes, and, among them, even Whitmore, stiff and pale, found himself rising to his feet, though he couldn't quite meet Ethan's gaze. Later, at the reception, Hawthorne approached Ethan with a proud smile. "You could have embarrassed him," he said, quietly glancing toward Whitmore brooding alone by the punch table. "But you didn't," Ethan shrugged, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It was never about them," he replied. "It was always about the work, about what it could mean for others." And in that moment, Hawthorne understood. True greatness isn't measured by how loudly you defeat your enemies. It's measured by how quietly you inspire them to change. The university, once blind to Ethan's brilliance, now vowed to champion unseen talents, launching new initiatives to find and support hidden prodigies, a ripple effect that would change countless lives. But for Ethan Blake, none of that glory mattered. All he wanted was to return home, hold Claire close, and tell her, truthfully this time, that it had been a good day, a very good day. In the days that followed, the story of Ethan Blake spread beyond the ivy-covered walls of the university. News outlets picked up whispers of the janitor genius, crafting headlines that swung between admiration and disbelief. Interviews were requested, panels were offered, scholarships flooded in from institutions that now scrambled to align themselves with his name. But Ethan remained grounded. He politely declined most interviews, choosing instead to focus on what truly mattered to him, helping others find their own light. With Claire's unwavering support, Ethan and Dr. Hawthorne co-founded a new initiative at the university, the Blake Program for Hidden Scholars, a scholarship and mentorship foundation dedicated to uncovering and nurturing untapped brilliance, regardless of background or appearance. The program opened doors for dozens of students in its first year alone, students who, like Ethan, had been dismissed by a world obsessed with surface-level status. Meanwhile, life at the university changed, too. The janitorial staff received raises and respect. Students were taught not just theorems, but empathy. Professors who once held tight to their ivory towers learned to open their doors and their hearts a little wider. And yet, despite the growing recognition, Ethan never stopped cleaning. Twice a week, he still mopped the marble floors of the mathematics hall, now a quiet symbol of humility and perseverance, not because he had to, but because he chose to. A reminder to himself and to everyone watching of where true greatness comes from. One afternoon, as Ethan buffed the same spot on the floor where Whitmore had once mocked him, a young boy approached, clutching a worn-out backpack. "Sir," he said shyly, "how did you get so smart?" Ethan smiled warmly, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "I never stopped believing I could," he said, "even when no one else did." The boy nodded, his face lighting up with hope, and scampered off to class. Ethan watched him go, feeling something deep within him settle, like the final piece of a long-forgotten puzzle clicking into place. He hadn't endured for fame. He hadn't survived for recognition. He had lived his truth, quietly, steadily, fiercely, and in doing so, he had changed more than just his own life. He had changed the world around him. And sometimes he realized that's exactly how revolutions begin. In the quiet, in the overlooked, in the hearts of simple men who refuse to give up. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, Ethan Blake's story offered a quiet but resounding reminder. Greatness often comes wrapped in the most unassuming packages. It's easy to respect titles. It's easy to admire polished speeches, sharp suits, and golden accolades. But true character, the kind that changes lives, that builds bridges across impossible divides, is forged in the unseen struggles, the private victories, the battles fought when no one is watching. Ethan never demanded the world's attention. He never asked for applause. He simply showed up, with a heart full of hope, a mind brimming with brilliance, and hands willing to do the work most others wouldn't. He taught by example that dignity is not tied to wealth, nor is intelligence reserved for those sitting in gilded chairs. He proved that humility and greatness are not opposing forces. They are, in fact, soulmates. For every Ethan out there, the overlooked, the underestimated, the ones who carry their dreams quietly while the world looks the other way, his story whispers a sacred truth. You are seen. You matter. And sometimes, the most powerful revolutions don't start with thunderous declarations. They begin with a single act of quiet resilience. So the next time you pass by someone you think you already understand, stop. Look again. Behind those tired eyes, behind that humble smile, might stand a mind, a heart, a spirit capable of lighting up the world. And if you're wise enough to truly see them, you might just find yourself changed, too. Because real greatness doesn't always shout, sometimes it simply shines.